Welcome to part 7 in our series on the book Falling Flat by Dr. Danny Faulkner. And today we're going to pick up on a section called diving airplanes, where there's a theory of, or belief, or whatever you want to call it, of some, not all, and not even probably a majority, of people in the flat earth community who maintain that in order for an airplane to fly level around a ball, it must continually nose up, or nose down, and to follow the curvature. Otherwise, if it goes in an absolute straight line, which is to say perpendicular to a radius of the Earth, then it will unavoidably go out off into quote-unquote space, because it will fly in a straight line, the 90 degrees. But there's, in the ball Earth logic, a difference between 90 degrees to a radius and level. They redefine level as equidistant to the surface of a ball, which of course presupposes a ball in the first place. But that's what he's going over in this section, is starting on a page, about page 190 or so, and 96, something like that. And he says then but the plane doesn't need to dive at all to maintain level flight. Level flight means keeping the same altitude above mean sea level, and that we can agree on. As the plane moves forward, mean sea level gradually curves beneath the plane, not abruptly as his calculations suggest, begging the question. But anyway, therefore, as the plane maintains constant altitude over a spherical Earth, the plane follows the curvature of the Earth. Once again, hiding in this argument put forth by flat earthers is the importance of their notion of gravity, a notion that is foreign to the spherical Earth. Therefore, this too is a straw man argument. He should know quite a bit about straw man arguments, because how exactly is gravity hidden in this argument? What's gravity have to do with any of this? It has to do with the physical nature of Earth, not what's holding the airplane up. Does Danny not understand that his model is under examination here? He's talking about what he thinks flat earthers say about his model. So if he's going to do that, and as I've said in an earlier video, put a sock puppet on each hand and pretend he's arguing with the other side, when in fact he's misrepresented it knowingly. But the problem here is that he just switches horses in midstream, which is, I think, an equivocation fallacy, actually, but he starts out saying, why wouldn't an airplane have to keep its nose up, nose down to, I keep saying that, follow the curvature of the Earth? Danny says it doesn't need to do that to follow the curvature, and then he switches to gravity. Go figure. I don't know. Anyway, the point is, if you know anything about aerodynamics, that an airplane does have a slight upward pitch to keep the proper pressure on the wings and the proper lift, and that this has a lot to do with air pressure and not so much anything really to do with gravity other than getting off the ground. In level flight, that's not the issue, is air pressure. That's how wings work. They work with air pressure. And so anyway, kind of a different topic, which he just threw in there after talking about whether airplanes have to follow curvature. He assumes they do, but disagrees with Eric Dubé's proposed solution or proof, or whatever you want to call it. Then he goes on to how do rockets work in space, and he says, as we'll see in chapter 8, flat earthers deny that we have ventured into space. And it isn't, I should say, it's not just flat earthers. There are many others who are not flat earthers who believe we've never left Earth, or at least low Earth orbit. They reason that this is impossible because the dome covering would prevent orbital motion. I've never heard such a wild non sequitur. I don't know any flat earthers who would make this argument. Though the primary reason to reject trips to outer space is because it can't exist. Air pressure without a container is impossible, especially next to a giant vacuum. And I would argue also that the vacuum needs a container. If you ever have seen a vacuum chamber, the word chamber is a dead giveaway. Vacuums don't naturally occur so much. I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to find one in nature that is a true vacuum, or even not necessarily an ideal vacuum, but at very much lower pressure than the surrounding air. if it's not contained by rock or something like that. So the problem is that it's a violation of the laws of thermodynamics and the laws of the gas laws. Gas will always fill available space. It doesn't have a shape of its own. The gas molecules or elements will always try to fly away from each other in all directions. You won't find any consideration for gravity in these gas laws. Gas just doesn't care about gravity. It will always, that's why one of the reasons why we have an air cycle, a vertical air cycle as well as a horizontal, is because hot air rises. Everybody knew that from the earliest grades of school. And cold air falls, and this is part of the water cycle, etc., with evaporation and so forth. But why would it follow, that's why I mentioned non sequitur, that because we have a dome preventing orbital motion, that we haven't been to space? There's a very slim connection, at best. But his method, I don't know if you call it a method, but a habit of inadequately explaining things as you would expect a professor to do, is just defying all reason. I mean, I don't know what to say about someone who would teach this way. Anyway, as I've said, the primary reason to reject trip to outer space is that you can't have air pressure without a container. And, especially when the vacuum, the much lower pressure, is way more volume than the air that's under pressure. And then he just, going on to a next section called Flat Earthers Don't Understand Physics, which is ad hominem and a baseless accusation. He says, if it isn't obvious already, flat earthers fail to comprehend physics. This sweeping generalization fallacy also works on Ball and young earthers. Everybody says that about everybody. It doesn't prove anything at all. And then he says, just because some people fail to understand something doesn't mean it isn't true. Again, that principle also applies to Ball and young earthers. There are Christians who are saved who can't articulate the gospel. I'm not sure how that's possible, but it's a thing. So consistency isn't his strong suit anyway, so we'll just have to move on from there. Of course, it doesn't mean that something isn't true just because people don't understand it. The question here is why he has to resort to ad hom so much to try to debunk something. This has been his habit. Now, in the next chapter, 7, it's about geocentrism and flat Earth. And he says, geocentrists use physical arguments, but their main motivation seems to be their belief that the Bible teaches that the Earth does not move. Why can't you just ask people what their motives are? And let's also ask you what your motives are. Oh, we already have. You volunteered that information. You're afraid. But he's projecting his fear on other people and confirmation bias on other people, etc. So again, Danny divines the motive of others instead of asking them, and then burns a straw man, which he faults flat earthers for doing. But is he talking about flat earth or geocentrism? Who is confusing these two again? And then he said it should be obvious that flat earthers must be geocentrists, duh. But he says one ought not to confuse the traditional or Tychonic geocentrists described above with flat earth movement. It's ironic, though, that after these geocentrists had labored for decades, the sudden rise in the flat earth movement has resulted in there being more flat earth geocentrists today than there are geocentrists who believe Earth is a sphere. I don't care. This isn't a popularity contest. And then he says, to add insult to injury, flat earthers use many of the arguments, both physical and biblical, that they borrowed from these geocentrists. How do you know that? You got any citation? Of course not. He says, however, it is doubtful that any flat earthers understand the physical arguments as well as most Tychonic geocentrists do. Did you take a survey? Based on what evidence, Danny? Surely you must look down your nose equally at geocentrists who also reject your model. Are they not making the Bible look bad too? You're not a geocentrist. Why don't you take off after them as much as you do flat earthers? Or just lump us all into geocentrism, since you can't seem to tell the two apart either. Then he said, it's not my intent here to offer a complete rebuttal to geocentrism, because you can't. And then right after saying this, he makes a remark about geocentrists, and then it's back to flat earthers. I don't think he can stay on a topic for very long. Going on to the subtopic motion, the only motion we can measure is relative motion. Exactly, so how is it that you insist it's not the stars that move? Even though your model has them all expanding away from Earth at breakneck speed and not always in straight lines. Are the stars moving or not? They're just not moving the way you, flat earthers aren't saying they move the way you want them to. And then he says, every system of thought must begin with a few axioms, definitions, and postulates from which conclusions can be reached. This is an admission that even his model depends upon certain axioms, or givens, or just so stories, if you will, things that you hold to be self-evident. Okay, however you want to word that, everybody does it. Does he not realize that this means he cannot disprove models based upon different axioms? Let he is without sin cast the first stone, I might say. And then he talks about water and finding its level and stuff. And then he says about how you spin a bucket of water around your head. He says it's a classic experiment. It's not an experiment. It's not trying to prove something. It's just a demonstration. So he says the classic experiment with regard to the question of what is moving is a pail of water that's suspended by a rope that is allowed to unwind, thus spinning the pail. Eventually, friction between the bucket and water causes the water to spin too. As the water spins, its surface develops a concavity. How does the water know that it is spinning and that it ought to develop this concavity in response? Matter does what it was programmed to do, Danny. It doesn't need to be self-aware, and this analogy makes no sense on the issue of earth motion. Can you not grasp the difference between what and why? Earth motion is a what question. Do we observe it objectively, or must we presume it based upon your preferred axioms? If we're trying to make a connection that he doesn't even try to make here to his opening statements. But the bigger problem is the water on Earth on the inside or the outside? Let's put the water outside that bucket and spin it around and see what happens. There's no container, right, Danny? Or does gravity magically hold the water to the bucket? And if not, if it doesn't do this on a small scale, why do you think it does it on a large scale? Nothing makes sense that he's trying to argue here, if you can call it arguing. And then he says, also keep in mind that this is an assumption that makes physics as we know it impossible. Now, what's he talking about? He says Mach's principle, named for Ernst Mach, who wrote about this more than a century ago, though he wasn't the first. Original form of his principle applied to distant stars as a standard whereby to gauge motion, treating them as if they're fixed, even though you say they're not, that they're moving. Oh, but they're so small and far away, we can pretend they're not. Are we playing pretend? Then he says, our understanding of cosmology has changed a bit since then, so today we'd prefer the average of many distant galaxies and quasars or the cosmic microwave background. What? That's an evolutionary kind of a thing, as the standard of rest. But keep in mind that this is a convention that conforms to much of what we know of physics. Really? Only what we know of physics is what we can see here on Earth. Also keep in mind, he says, that this is an assumption that makes physics as we know it possible. You have to assume something so you can do physics. No, all we have to do is observe. Then he says, in a very real sense, we don't know what the absolute standard of rest is. And I'm trying to figure out, that second statement I made read earlier, the assumptions made is that physics, it's the matter of the universe, is at rest with respect to space. What is space? If, as it seems, Danny uses the word, it's simply not matter, he needs to observe and test this entity. But by definition, natural science can only be concerned with physical phenomena, which space is not. Thus, it would be valid to substitute space with Narnia for his arguments. So he wants us to be able to assume in physics that the matter of the universe, whatever that means, is at rest with respect to space. I can't make sense of that. It's probably why I skipped it in my notes accidentally, or reading on the page there. And again, we get back to where he says we have to assume something. It might as well be our model, not the flat earthers, right? And then he says he presumes that it's the only assumption that makes physics possible. So false dilemma, etc., or sampling bias. He says, however, physics works very well with the assumption of Mach's principle, giving us confidence that it's correct. We're confident in our assumption. So if it can work well enough, it must be true. Isn't that what evolutionists say? Many people insist that yoga gives them inner peace, so how does that mean Hinduism is true? This is a hasty generalization fallacy. It's also affirming the consequent. For example, if someone talks about me, my ears will burn. My ears are burning, therefore someone is talking about me. Likewise, if a theory is true, it will work. My theory works, therefore it must be true. That's the essence of his fallacious argument. And then he says, shockingly, if you think that I'm engaging in doublespeak here, then you have failed to grasp my discussion of motion. There's problem lies with you, not with me. Again, Danny attributes disagreement to lack of understanding. But yes, Danny, we think you're engaging in doublespeak here. Or are you now grasping the fallacious nature of your claims? He's trying to hedge his bets, but doing a really bad job of it. Then he says, but then somewhere along the line, geocentrists changed tack and claim that they can scientifically prove that the Earth doesn't move. I thought you were talking about geocentrists, not talking about geocentrists, but flat earthers in this book specifically. And your own follow-up question can be thrown back at you, Danny. How can you scientifically prove something that you claimed is based on certain axioms, especially when earlier in the book you said science can only disprove things, not prove them? The inconsistencies and self-contradictions are just mind-boggling in this book. Now he goes to a section called the experiments. He says by the 19th century, considerable physical evidence had accumulated that indicated light is a wave phenomenon. A wave is a periodic vibration in a medium. Okay, so what is the medium of light? It can pass through transparent things such as air, water, and glass, but can also pass through a vacuum. No other wave does that. Wait a minute. Okay, so he's saying light can go through a vacuum. That's oversimplified because it's electromagnetic energy that can go through a vacuum. Radio waves, phone signals, microwaves, whatever. If it's electromagnetic, it can go through stuff. And you need something like metal to block it. So very oversimplified, but then we consider the low-hanging fruit he's aiming his book at. Therefore, physicists deduce that space must be filled with a medium. This is what we call the etherites make the same mistake. There are different kinds of waves, which is very, I'll try and remember to put a link in my description for this about explaining the physics of light. But anyway, notice that the whole premise for ether, which is why I said etherites, was simply to explain how light waves travel in a vacuum. You presume a lot of things in that statement. There is no direct observation of ether. In fact, by definition, it's impossible to observe. You can't sample it, you can't control it, so you can't do science on it. And it was, he makes a note here that physicists called this medium the luminiferous ether, shortened to ether and spelled a couple different ways. Luminiferous simply means has to do with light. That's all it means. And he talks about electromagnetic waves as far as, he's just saying light, but that's hopefully what he had in mind, but failed to write or communicate. He said it didn't seem to have mass, but had incredible strength and elasticity, the ether, seeing that it was capable of immediately closing in behind objects as they moved, and the ether didn't seem to interact with matter in any way. Well, that, of course, is going to change in time with various demonstrations, such as the photoelectric effect, which proves that it does indeed interact with physical things. If you don't know, you know what a photocell is. And all it is a light-sensitive material. When light hits it, it closes the circuit, so to speak. It acts like a switch with no moving parts. This is just demonstratable. I mean, whether anybody understands how it really works is beside the point. It works. So if you shine light on a sensor, and I've built photosensors, it will make the circuit close like a switch, and so electricity flows, and then you can turn off the light and the switch opens and it stops. So anyway, I don't think he explained that very well in the book. If he tried at all, I don't remember. But he talks about interferometers in the Michelson-Morley experiment. And then he says there was a null result of that so-called experiment. And he says, what does this null result mean? One possibility is the one favored by all modern geocentrists, that the Earth is not moving. It isn't because of this one thing. We just don't observe motion. Anyway, Occam's razor would favor this conclusion, Danny, that the Earth is not moving. That's the Occam's razor conclusion. Then he says the best conclusion was that the ether, and he's talking about the past, at least as understood by 19th century classical physics, did not exist. And I have a link to ethertheory.co.uk that says this isn't the only or even the best conclusion. Anyway, moving on, the new ether. He says in Newtonian physics, it's axiomatic that space and time are absolutes. So it's axiomatic, it's an assumption, not a proof. Neither space, still waiting on a definition, nor time are material, ergo science cannot measure, control, or prove any claims about them. One must first prove their existence before claiming they're absolutes. So theories about how non-absolute they are can be rightly compared to arguments about the engineering of the Starship Enterprise. It's all very fascinating to some people, but we're not looking for fiction here, are we? At least the flat earthers aren't. Then he talks about some developments. He says, part one was the Lorentz-Fitzgerald contraction already worked out in terms of a modified ether theory. However, that modification required several ad hoc assumptions. Gosh, we're well familiar with those in this book, that seem to have no real basis. Who decided? Furthermore, Einstein's solution sidestepped the ether because it didn't rely on any medium for light to travel through. That is, Einstein's special theory of relativity did not appear to require the existence of the ether. And then that same year, he published the photoelectric effect. This was built on Max Planck's explanation, some say plagiarized. There are entire websites dedicated to the examination of the claim whether Einstein was a massive plagiarist. Anyway, of blackbody radiation published 5 years earlier. Both explanations proposed that light was a particle. Unlike waves, particles don't require a medium to travel. These two developments probably led to the conclusion by Einstein and other physicists at the time that there was no ether. Probably? Danny doesn't know and didn't try to find out, as far as I can tell. Then he says quantum physics and modern relativity are the twin pillars of what we now call modern physics. These two pillars don't necessarily play well together, though. And what happened to Occam's razor again? Now we're getting into quantum physics, very highly theoretical things as well. And we're still basing things on axioms. Anyway, he said physicists now began to speak of a four-dimensional space-time, usually referred to as space. Now we've moved the goalpost to something you can't possibly examine. Finally, we have a definition for space, at least. It really means some four-dimensional thing called space-time, where space is used in its own definition. It also thinks time is an entity that can speed up or slow down. Your clocks can do that, but time itself is not subject to anybody's instruments. People will say, well, I have an atomic clock here and an atomic clock there, and they get out of sync. It must be space-time. No, it's clocks behaving differently in different environments. That's all it is. Your clocks are not perfect. Sorry to burst your bubble, but not sorry. Anyway, we have to invent a fourth dimension. Now, we know intuitively, physically, as far as that's the limits of natural science, is the physical, that there are only three dimensions. To call something else a dimension is actually an equivocation fallacy, because you're trying to change the meaning of the word in order to support some argument made out of thin air, literally. Well, not even thin air. Might as well be ether. And then he says, essentially, this makes space a thing. We may not know what space is, but we know much about its properties. Only by math. The passage of time is a concept, a perception, not an entity, not a thing. It can't be dissected, manipulated, or quantified. All we can do is invent clocks based upon the pattern of luminaries in the sky. Is it in the hands on the clock? Is it the hands on the clock that move, or is it really we who spin around the hands to make them only appear to move? Does a slow clock mean time itself has slowed? These are rhetorical questions, Danny. I know there are flat earthers who say the same thing, but they are decidedly in the minority as far as I can tell. And then he says, he goes back to Mach's principle, and that it suggests there is a preferred standard of rest defined by the matter of the universe, which is always in motion. After he published his paper on general relativity, Einstein came to realize that space itself could be a sort of ether. So space is the new ether, which was invented only to explain how light could wave through a vacuum, all while quantum physics says light is a particle too. This is getting so twisted. But we shouldn't be surprised, should we? And then he says, and we're around page 208, 209, besides four-dimensional space-time, there is at least one other candidate for the ether. So we're trying to figure out what ether is for some reason and why this has anything to do with flat Earth. Your guess is as good as mine. And as I've said, dimensions are aspects of physical material objects with depth and height. Calling something else a dimension is nonsense, just as nonsensical as space-time. And as I said, it's an equivocation fallacy because you're trying to change horses in midstream. You're trying to change the definitions of words so you can make your theories work out. Anyway, he says this other candidate found during the other half of the 19th century, or the first half of the 19th century, had many experimental results that demonstrated the relationship between electricity and magnetism. Okay, no problem there, electromagnetism. Whether you have one moving, you have the other. Up to this time, electricity and magnetism were viewed as separate, different phenomena, but these experiments led to their unification. This unification was propounded by four elegant equations worked out by James Clerk Maxwell in the second half of the 19th century. So, solution of these four equations results in the propagation of a wave in electric and magnetic fields. Again, I'll have some explanations of this in my link in the description that I will hopefully remember to post, that travels at the speed measured for light. Maxwell did not consider this a coincidence. So then it developed to the point we now call light and other related waves electromagnetic radiation. He finally gets to that. He should have pointed this out before the other section on light. And then he says, this is probably, he loves that word, the best candidate for the medium of light. Medium of light? I thought it didn't need a medium. And he says, note that it's very different from the classical ether of the 19th century. Is it really? So Danny still presumes that light must have a medium. And none of this has anything to do with Earth shape or Earth motion. Either one, that he can't seem to keep straight. He also never explains how or why electromagnetic radiation, quote, results in the propagation of a wave, end quote. Energy is transferred much the way a Newton's cradle does. The individual atoms, whatever one wishes to think of those, vibrate in place, but the energy, in practical terms, the ability to do work, moves in pulses we could think of as waves. Ergo, the electromagnetic radiation beam is its own medium, but it has direction, or else there'd be no way to control and use it. So how can electromagnetic radiation possibly be anything like space or ether? How can we have individual electromagnetic beams in a huge sea of electromagnetic radiation? None of this is explained in the book. Okay, so now we go, he actually looks at the Bible briefly here. He says in chapters 10 and 11 he'll do that. I thought that was the point of the book. Anyway, he says, I discussed the supposed biblical argument for the earth being flat. There I mentioned a list of 240 plus supposed flat earth Bible verses. One heading on the list is that earth is fixed and immovable. That list includes verses that geocentrists have used for a long time. And then he reads 1 Chronicles 16:30 tremble before him all the earth. Yes, the world is established, it shall never be moved. Another is Psalm 93:1, 96:10, and 104:5. Set the earth on its foundations, it should never be moved. All four verses clearly and emphatically state that the earth shall never be moved. Therefore, by the literal hermeneutic, the one, I don't know, Danny, the one you use for Genesis 1 for evening and morning, day 1, the earth must be stationary. But let's consider Psalm 16:8. I have set the Lord always before me, because he has at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Here David is speaking of himself. If one is consistent, does he even know what that means, in the literal hermeneutic, I would literally laugh out loud, but I'm trying to be professional here. If one is consistent in the literal hermeneutic, David must have remained stationary the remainder of his life. Wow. Like your consistency in Genesis 1, Danny? And what do old earthers say about it? Do you have any idea what consistent literalism is? I explain that on my website. Certainly there are figures of speech in the Bible, but the fact is that never, in any context or genre, does the Bible speak of earth spinning or orbiting. That is, that it nowhere states that the earth is immovable should be irrelevant, given your insistence that it can't be taken literally. But again, the fact is that the Bible, even in most poetic or allegorical context, never, ever speaks of the earth moving, unless it's just being shaken by God, which is not anywhere close to orbiting or spiraling through space, chasing the sun. So the burden of proof is on him to find something that supports his theory. In fact, all he has is these stationary statements, and he is trying to conflate two very different contexts. So then he says, the list rounds out with 4 more verses. One verse is Psalm 33:9. For he spoke and it came to be, he commanded, and it stood firm. Does he think that every instance of stood firm is in the same context? Is this what he thinks is the literal hermeneutic? Wow. And again, how is this less literal than Genesis 1's evening and morning, the nth day? The same God who commanded, let there be light, also commanded, and it stood firm. And then he says, again, there's hardly anything geocentric in this verse, so it isn't clear why it's on the list. Isn't this about flat, motionless Earth rather than geocentrism? You know, he can't remember his own subtopic. Why is Danny whining about a lack of geocentric language in these verses? He says, clearly none of the 9 passages listed under this heading teach that the Earth is fixed and immovable, just as none of the days of creation week say Earth is young, Danny. Every criticism you make against flat Earth also debunks young Earth, not because neither is true, but because your arguments are just that bad. And I have a link to something called thenaturalhistorian.com, Ignoring the Plank. A young Earth apologist inadvertently writes a brilliant critique of young Earth creationism. Now, just my standard disclaimer, no, I don't agree with this person that both young and flat Earth are ludicrous or unscientific, as he believes, but he's pointing out a very important thing, that Danny's arguments against flat Earth can be easily changed by substituting a few words into an argument against young Earth creationism. That's how bad his arguments are. And then he says, there's a heading called Sun Moves, Not the Earth in that list. 53 verses. Most of them mention sunrise or sunset, but a few use them to refer euphemistically to directions east or west. Of course, this makes those passages non-literal. No. I mean, he's, on one level, the most superficial, which I think is all the deeper we can go in this book. We speak of sunrise and sunset, but that doesn't mean they have to be allegorical. But anyway, he says, as I discussed above, this means nothing. I can use that too, because motion can be a tricky thing. Oh, really? No more Occam's razor. Other astronomers and I speak today of sunrise and sunset. Fine. We also speak of the moon, planets, and stars rising and setting. In a very real sense, all these astronomical bodies rise and set. In a real sense, they're moving. Remember, in his model, they're moving. So why can't we take it literally? However, we also understand that it is the Earth's rotation that causes this motion. Well, wait a minute. You said they were moving, actually. And he's presuming this. He's begging the question. And then He says, furthermore, there's an inconsistency here. All I can do not to laugh out loud, literally. As I put here, it says the king of inconsistency. Context is king, he then says on the next page. We're on about 213. Exactly, Danny. Show us a context where the earth is described as moving. Psalm 99:1 says, let the earth be moved, not that it does. Does Genesis 1 ever hint that the earth spins or orbits? No, it even has the earth day and night before the sun. Anyway, he says, therefore, if the earth's rotation stopped during the Battle of Gibeon, we're talking about Joshua's long day, then the sun would have appeared to stop in the sky. Nowhere in this section does Danny explain what happened to cause the apparent stoppage. In his model, it had to be Earth stopped spinning. Does he think there'd be no consequences? Would he play the miracle card? Yes, in a video where he goes over his book, he says this exact thing. It's a miracle that everything didn't fly off the surface at a tangent. Occam's razor again. Which would be simpler, to stop the motion of the sun and moon, or to stop the earth from spinning and then deal with all the consequences of that, where anything not bolted to the earth would go flying off in a straight line off into space? Oh, but it's a miracle. We only invoke them when they're necessary for our theory, Danny? Are we being too literal or too consistent? Anyway, he says in Young's literal translation, Acts 27:27 reads, and when the 14th night came, we being borne up and down in the Adriatic Sea, toward the middle of the night, the sailors were supposing that some country drew nigh to them. And he says he cherry-picked Young's translation here. According to the New English Translation's footnote, this is an idiom for land was near. If they wanted to say land was near, they said it was approaching, which the actual literal hermeneutic recognizes. This has exactly nothing to do with relative motion. Granted that not all of the verses in the 200-plus list are solid proofs or consider context, they make some similar mistakes, but showing how badly he misinterprets expressions disqualifies him from showing them their alleged errors. He doesn't know the first thing about interpreting the Bible from what I've seen in this book. And then he says, whatever the nature of the cosmology and the miracle it required, it is a true description that the sun did stop for about a day, and there it is. Somehow, in spite of this being a miracle, the cause of the observation has to be something other than what the sun and moon literally stopped in the sky, though Danny can't imagine what that something else might be. And he has the nerve to use the terms eisegesis or eisegesis and exegesis. Eisegesis means you're reading into the text, you're putting something into it. Exegesis means you take only what the text gives you. He has demonstrated his lack of understanding of how to use this, or what the difference is. And then he says in his conclusion, this chapter is not meant to be an exhaustive treatment of geocentrism. Well, that's much as true. You couldn't remember your topic. Rather, here I have demonstrated the vacancy of the flat earth version of geocentrism. He's done no such thing, and he wavered continually between geocentrism in general and earth shape. But again, we are not surprised at all. So now we're going on to Chapter 8, NASA and a Flat Earth. He says, right at the start, if the Earth is a flat disk, he knows that's not what we think, covered by a dome, not everyone thinks that contains, yes, there must be a container, all astronomical bodies, then the moon cannot orbit the Earth. What? Only the Controlled Opposition Group Flat Earth Society, Eric Dubé, says this. So again, Danny Burns, the straw man his whole book is based upon. Regardless, orbit begs the question. And I'm sorry, I had nothing to show you on the screen. I forgot to hide that thumbnail. He says, let me read that again. If the Earth is a flat disk covered by a dome that contains all astronomical bodies, then the moon cannot orbit the Earth. Only the Controlled Opposition Group Flat Earth Society says this. So again, Danny Burns, the straw man that his whole book is based upon. Regardless, orbit begs the question. We simply say it, and all the other luminaries move over it. And we Christians accept that they're in the firmament per Scripture. Genesis 1. Whether the whole firmament moves or the luminaries move within it, they don't orbit. This entire introductory paragraph sets the tone of the chapter as based upon wholly false premises of his own invention. And then he says, nor can satellites orbit the Earth. Therefore, there are no satellites. Or Moon is considered a satellite in their model. This is a non sequitur. It does not follow that since things don't orbit, then they can't exist. This is pathetic logic coming from any PhD. Danny is trying to make all objections to orbiting objects based solely on Earth shape. Does he not know that many who reject spaceflight and satellites are ball earthers? Why shouldn't he be lumped in with them? Then he says, flat earthers spend considerable time and effort attempting to debunk all things from NASA and arguing against NASA. Again, not only flat earthers. Since there are ball earthers who reject these things, should we follow Danny's example and smear all ball earthers? Why not? Moving right along, he has a subtopic, what's in a name? And then he says about the claim that NASA means to deceive in Hebrew. Is this a spacious argument? I agree. It's a bad argument. But again, there are young Earth creationists who make very bad arguments as well. Danny chief among them. So I'm not sure how he's qualified to judge what a spacious argument is. But anyway, in this case, I agree that NASA is just an acronym for English words. It doesn't have anything to do with a slightly different Hebrew word that means deception or something like that. So then he says, who has told us that there is a thermosphere and its temperature is so high? So orbiting in the thermosphere of this section. Danny is oblivious or in denial or in deception of the fact that it's his model making these claims. So when we ask how metallic objects can float in such temperatures, we're challenging his claims, not making a claim of our own. This tactic seems fairly typical of anti-flat earthers, but I'd expect better from an experienced professional astronomer. And then he says, many flat earthers, don't know who they are, use the term thermosphere in this argument with no sense of irony. Really, Danny, not only have many flat earthers pointed out that the sphere suffix begs the question, do you expect us not to use the standard name for something, not to mention that it's your model we're challenging? We could say atmolayer or thermolayer if it would make you happy, but to major in the minors like this indicates desperation to fill a book with trivia. More and more, the book seems mostly filled with unhinged diatribes, not worthy of response. Then he says the thermosphere is very rarefied, making it a very hard vacuum. A hard vacuum next to massive air pressure, Danny? The only reaction is to play the wild card gravity is a container, which it somehow never is on Earth's surface, since gas pressure is always measured with respect to a container that isn't gravity. So this hard vacuum cannot exist according to the laws of physics. More accurately, the laws of nature. And then he says, at the same time, the spacecraft in this environment will cool by emitting infrared radiation. How is an object cooled if there's not enough air to transfer the energy to? You can't have it both ways, Danny. If there's not enough air to heat metal, then there's not enough air to cool it. According to sciencenews.org, heat transfer, what Danny is trying to discuss here, can only happen in a vacuum if the distance from the radiating body to some receptor, such as air, is on the order of nanometers. So even if the sun's rays heat the metal, there's no way to dissipate it to the shadow side. And he has the gall to say this is a bogus argument on the part of flat earthers. No, it's exposure of a self-contradictory claim by ball earthers. Now he's going to go on to the Van Allen belts. If you don't know, it's supposedly belts of radiation that surround the Earth. And he says, goes on for a while, and then he says, with larger analog devices back then in the 60s, when they were, 69 was supposedly the Apollo missions went to the moon. With larger analog devices back then, there was a far less risk of damage through radiation. Regardless of whether alleged astronauts suffered harm, we all have seen in recent years how officials are reluctant to admit fault. The question Danny completely ignores is not the vulnerability of modern digital electronic devices, but the photographic film used in the 1960s. Of course, like the claim minimal harm to life, the same is made for film, according to space.stackexchange.com, and they talk about this very question. But to measure radiation in outer space, one must first prove that this entity exists. We're not going to argue over the schematics of the Starship Enterprise until you show me this real starship. But he says for the Apollo program, there were even more factors. Danny completely misses the point here. We're not talking about, and this is under laws of technology, sorry. We're not talking about complexity and compartmentalization because that refutes too many people would have to be in on it claim, but about a historical event of monumental importance. No bureaucratic ineptitude can explain away the loss of bleeding edge technology that amazed the whole world. How big was the Manhattan Project? How compartmentalized was it? Did we lose that technology? Did NASA not keep records of who they paid for what? This is a classic red herring and misdirection attempt on Danny's part. That's all there is to say about it. And again, going to the moon or not is not strictly a flat Earth issue. And then he says, it never seems to occur to the critics that if we desired to return to the moon, would we want to do so with plans that are now 50 years old? Even when current NASA employees say we can't go back because we lost that technology, they're giving the reason, not that we just don't care about it. Is Danny being completely dishonest or utterly clueless? I think we already know the answer to that question. And moving on under loss of Apollo mission telemetry, he says a diligent search was launched for the tapes, but they were never found. Here Danny footnotes the end scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. Who exactly has a need to concoct the story of the lost tapes, Danny? You admit you just took one straight out of the movies. The rest of the section is more the same ad hoc fallacy, so we're not going to go over that. But other people from NASA say it wasn't just that they weren't found, it's that somebody overwrote them. I don't know who to believe. Maybe I shouldn't believe any of them. And he has the gall to ask about, under a section about Freemason astronauts, are all these people lying? It seems that all Danny has at this point are fallacies. Here we have two. Why would they lie? Appeal to motive or ad hominem circumstantial. And too many people would have to be in on it. Argument from incredulity. And then he says, after all, the claim by flat earthers is that all astronauts have been Freemasons, as if being a Freemason is a prerequisite to becoming an astronaut. So every time Danny says all flat earthers, he means all without exception, and he can support every one of those claims? He's picking low-hanging fruit and a whole bunch of other things going on here, which we've already exposed. And then he says, by the way, the belief that NASA faked the Apollo moon landings has been around longer than the Flat Earth movement. Finally, he finally admits that this whole chapter has been about something that isn't exclusive to the Earth-shaped debate. Why did he spend all that time on it? And how professional is it for him to refer to these non-flat earthers as cranks? Again, whoever doesn't agree with Danny is a crank, or an idiot, or a liar. Under fake moon landing photos, there are too many examples, he says, of these that I can't take the time and space here to discuss them all. In other words, he can't answer them. This section is yet another waste of time and words in a book that's supposed to teach vulnerable Christians how to keep their faith in spite of these evil flat earthers. Again, can photos be fake? Yeah. Does it happen all the time? Yeah. And what does that have to do with Earth sheep? Absolutely nothing. And then he says there's this fake flat earther moon landing meme. He says this is the first photo of Apollo 12 landing on the moon. Who took the picture? It's a valid question. And he doesn't really answer this. He says this photograph has not been altered other than cropping and blowing up, but has been greatly misrepresented by those trying to prove NASA faked the Apollo missions. Nobody has to do that. I mean, didn't he do the same thing? Yes, he did, in a video I've seen recently from, I think, a few years ago, where he takes an image of oil rigs in the distance that shouldn't be visible at the distance they are, and we're using the oil rigs to establish the distance. You can see the horizon behind them. He crops that picture and cuts out the calculations that are written on it in order to burn a straw man and to misrepresent. So he cannot complain about this sort of thing, even if it were happening, which he has not established. And then he goes over a few memes and a bunch of drivel and some pictures. And he has one another faked moon landing meme with the subcaption Eratosthenes. I don't know. You tell me. Anyway, he's talking about the moon landing conspiracy theories, as he would call them, and not Earth shape. Anyway, and he even notices in one of the memes that if you take a NASA official photo with an astronaut either getting on or off the LEM, which is another issue all its own, and in the distance in the sky is a half Earth. And if you play with the exposure, you can see that the half Earth was photoshopped into it. Yeah, it's obvious fakery. Of course, that doesn't mean everything NASA does is faked, but you cannot find an actual photograph of the Earth from the moon because they're all edited, they're all photoshopped. And besides, if the moon is 1/4 the size of Earth, if you're standing on the moon, then the Earth should be 4 times bigger than the moon appears to us on Earth. So all we see is something that's the same size as the moon. Somebody doesn't understand some very basic things about optics. Anyway, he talks about the changing size of North America in the pictures and tries to explain them away. And he draws some diagrams, and we're skipping a lot of pages here. To page 235 or so, he says, in a similar manner, the satellite photographs that show varying sizes of terrestrial features at different times comes from different spacecraft orbiting at different distances. How does that change, not perspective, but relative sizes of things on the disk that they're seeing in this picture? Right? If the U.S. or the North American continent takes up, say, 1/3 of what we can see, no amount of changing the distance can change the percentage of area that land mass takes up. And then my note is, according to a Wikipedia article about the blue marble picture, NASA has verified all images of the 2012 blue marble are composites, as they cannot get far enough away and have to combine multiple photos together. And I would also add, on the LEM, or the lunar modules or the capsules that on its way to the moon has one little window. So you would have to turn the capsule back toward the Earth and make sure nothing moves at all in that frame and shoot that and not have any effect on your trajectory. And I'd also like to know how 3 astronauts crammed like sardines into that little capsule ever managed to change their diapers. I would like to know how that was done. Anyway, the wiki article goes on to say, likewise, these images do not fit together properly, and due to lighting, weather, and cloud interference, it's impossible to collect cohesive or fully clear images to begin with. End quote. Being composites from satellites, how great is the difference in distances anyway? Anything close to Danny's 12-1, none of them are explained away by Danny's whole photos from different distances. These images do not fit together properly. So if for this reason flat earthers can't use the images to challenge the size of the U.S. or the North American continent, then Danny can't use his photos that were not stitched together and not from the same distance. If he would then claim that there are other complete, actual one-piece photos from much farther away, he first have to at least bother to get references so we can examine them, and then remember he's begging the question that outer space exists and that we must blindly trust a money pit like NASA, whose claims cannot be corroborated by most people. In his conclusion, he says, the sample represented here demonstrates how shoddy these attempts are. No, Danny, it demonstrates how sloppy and lazy you are in failing to provide sources for the alleged photographs and coming up with such a poorly designed demonstration. You'll have to read that yourself on the book. I'm not going to go through that. I mean, if he can skip things, so can I. I'm following his example. And then he says, I suspect that the makers of the documentary put this together as a prank about moon landings. It makes a good study on how propaganda works. I suspect that Danny makes things up, and he has no awareness that the maker of the documentary is an anti-flat earther. Irony, Danny. He also has accused the makers of lying. Is he willing to prove his claim, or is he guilty of libel? I think we can figure out what the answer to that is. And even though I'm going to stop here in the middle of my notes just because we're close to our hour, and that ends a chapter, mercifully. We're going to start on chapter 9, Miscellaneous Claims About Flat Earth, next time. And he's going to talk about the shape of things that are not Earth, the sun and the moon. We should be used to this by now. It's no surprise. There are going to be no surprises in this book. But we're getting close to the end. According to my electronic version, I'm about to start page 237 of 378, and there are footnotes and things and illustrations. And I skipped quite a few pages today also, so I'm not sure how many more videos there will be, but we will finish the book. Especially, we'll take a look at that so-called biblical section. And hopefully, as I said in the last video, this will be helpful in some way, if nothing else, to expose how people can be so blind about how they project their own faults on others, and to be so disingenuous when they claim to be a subject matter expert. They cannot appeal to ignorance. They cannot appeal to lack of education or familiarity or not having the opportunity to talk to the people he likes to suppose lots of things about. This is not how you do anything right. Okay, so anyway, we'll get on with this next time. Thanks for listening.